In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use White Tie to build documentation for your project. I'm going to use JSON.NET, a popular open source project, as an example because it already builds documentation using Sandcastle Help File Builder. In the previous video, we left off after having configured this project to build a NuGet package using White Tie, and I haven't made any changes since then, so we're transitioning from that previous video right to this video to enable documentation. So if you remember from the previous video, when we first built the project, we got an error, so we disabled building documentation just so we could build the NuGet package and show how to do that. So in this video, the first thing we're going to do is re-enable documentation, and I'm going to show you what that error was and why it occurred and how to fix it. So I've edited or opened the project file to edit it, and you'll see there's a build documentation enabled to set to false here. So I'm just going to remove that and save. Now I'm going to reload the project again, and I'm just going to build it to reproduce the error. Okay, there we go. It just finished, and the error came up that we saw before. So I'm going to show you how to first, if you get into this situation, discover more details about the error. So you look at the output window and try to find the log file. You can just search for .log if you don't see it right away. And this is the file that Sandcastle Help File Builder generates with the log information. It would be more convenient, obviously, if I put the errors just in the error list, but it doesn't do that, so we don't have much of a choice. You just have to open the log file, and you can get more information about the error in here. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and the error is right here, code block component. So we know the error is related to inserting a code snippet because if we look at the source file, well, I already know this because I've reviewed it, but if we look at the source file, we see the path is related to the code block component, and the path is invalid. It's got two source folders, and it's pointing to the serialization test file, which is just a file that's being referenced in XML code comments somewhere in one of the C# files in here, and it's referencing the path to this file using a relative path so that it can be included as an example in the documentation. But the problem, and there's a reason why we got this error when we first added the White Tie NuGet package reference to this project, is because White Tie builds documentation using this project as the root, whereas the XML comments use relative paths under the assumption that the project building the documentation is actually outside of this project. It's a separate Sandcastle Help File Builder project somewhere else. So obviously the path's wrong. We would need to go through, well, there's two choices here. You can either go through all of the files that have these invalid references and fix them so that they work in White Tie, or we could just configure White Tie so that it changes the root directory that Sandcastle looks in. So I'll go ahead and edit the project file again. And let's scroll down a little bit here. Let's make some room here. So I have some code snippets, so you have to watch me type. There we go. So I've added two properties here. You'll see they start with an underscore. The concept of White Tie is to provide sensible defaults to build documentation and NuGet package and so on. It's minimal configuration, in most cases no configuration necessary. That's really the goal here. In this particular case, in order to solve this particular problem, we have to rebase the code block component. So you see here I set the code block component base path to some .dir directory, which I haven't defined yet, and Sandcastle namespace grouping I set to false, which is actually just a separate bug which we haven't even seen yet. And I just built this before and ran into it, so I realized the problem and I added this here. So now we just want to define the .dir property. So I'll just add it to the same property group. And that's properties here. So now we also want to include items, so let's add an item group here. Let's add the namespaces first. So if you want some namespace documentation, just add an item group, documentation namespace, and you'll see this is a separate one here. So you can add as many documentation namespaces as you want and include with the name of the namespace. And then a summary metadata, which is the actual documentation for that namespace. If this is an empty string, or if you just entirely omit this item, then the namespace is excluded from the documentation. So if you want a namespace excluded, you could define it here just with an empty summary, or just don't even define it at all. Let's add another item group. And let's add the remaining items. So now we have to pull in the content. So there's a few different ways to do this. You have, well, really essentially two choices here: documentation content and documentation image. Notice again, the word Sandcastle does not appear anywhere in here. This is generalized configuration. If you just stick to these properties, then you'll get documentation with whatever tool I choose to use in White Tie in the future with sensible default values. What's important here for the case of Sandcastle is that we know we build using AML content files. So if you add AML files, and this is just a recursive wildcard which says any subdirectory or the current directory with any file name that ends with an AML extension, we want that included. And of course, within the doc directory, which we defined up here. Let me just collapse this. We define that right here. So you could add as many content items as you want, and AML files, White Tie knows that Sandcastle uses them specifically to build conceptual content, so it puts them into the right place when it generates a Sandcastle help file builder project file. So that's why you can just put it right in the content, because it figures out what it is. And that's true for every kind of special file that Sandcastle supports. You just drop it in documentation content, and based on the extension, White Tie figures out what to do with it. So here's another one, content, which is basically like a table of contents layout file that Sandcastle requires. And you got to do it in the Sandcastle format if you choose to use this feature. It's optional. You don't have to do this. And as a matter of fact, you don't even have to include conceptual content files. So these are optional. This particular project, JSON.NET, has them, so I'm just referencing them. So the documentation that we build looks like the documentation that JSON.NET already builds. And then the documentation image is just wildcard for GIF, PNG, and JPEG files. So documentation images will generate the correct properties in the Sandcastle help file builder project file for both content and reference documentation. So every image you add gets added to both, so it's available in both. So you don't have to choose which one between the two. So that's it. We've added all the configuration that was necessary in order to get almost identical documentation. The current JSON.NET project builds, I think, the 2005 style. So it's an older style. So this is automatically, you get nicer documentation. You just got to tell it where the content comes from. And you don't even have to specify the sources or the framework, target framework, or anything like that. White Tie infers all these things for you. So let's go ahead and build it. One other thing you need to be aware of, which is very important, is that building your project in Visual Studio with White Tie, if you have Sandcastle installed and you're building in release mode, it's automatically going to build documentation for you. That's the default. Release builds with Sandcastle already installed builds documentation. If you don't have Sandcastle installed, then it won't even bother building documentation. White Tie just gracefully skips the documentation step and just does whatever else it does in release mode, like deploying the output to the deployment folder, building a NuGet package, and so on, running static analysis tools. So if you don't want Sandcastle to run, at the beginning of this video I showed you that build documentation enabled property. You just add that and set it to false, and then it won't build documentation release mode. The reason why it's very important to know that is because even for small projects, Sandcastle could take quite a long time, usually minutes. It could take much longer than that for large projects. So at that time, while it's building, you'll see Visual Studio is responsive, but you can't really do anything with it. It's very limited because it's doing a build, and this build is going to go on for quite a while. I think I've tested this before. On average, it's about 2 minutes and like 15 seconds. So I'm going to pause the video, and we'll come back when Sandcastle is finally completed. Okay, it looks like it just completed. 2 succeeded. That's a good sign. So I'm going to go ahead and open the project here. And you'll see there's a deployment folder. It actually is in there too, but I'm just going to show you that if we go to the bin folder of the project, and we go to release, and JSON.NET builds its output into subfolders because there are different flavors, but normally you would see the output in your release folder unless you've done something similar and configured it to go somewhere else. And there's the CHM file. There's something else that White Tie has done for us. It told Sandcastle to build IntelliSense files for us, and it overwrote the existing XML file. And then it also packaged that into the NuGet package that it generated. So in other words, if you look at code in IntelliSense, a lot of time you'll see summary and params, but you don't see remarks and see also links and those sorts of things. So Sandcastle strips all that stuff away, which is nice. So you get a much smaller XML file in your NuGet package. The CHM file now, let's take a look at that. So you'll see now we've got a compiled help file. So the existing project builds a website. By default, and White Tie just builds compiled help file. And you'll see here that these are all the documentation files, including the code snippets worked. Which one was that? There we go. So you'll see it actually found the code snippets. And here's the API reference, which we could double click and see documentation for all the namespaces was pulled in. And then you have nice MSDN style documentation for your entire project with all of your XML code comments included. And it's the latest and greatest presentation style that Sandcastle offers. And White Tie did all the heavy lifting of configuring Sandcastle for you.